So, well, a lot of the work in moral psychology over the last 10 years or so has borrowed thought experiments from philosophy, notoriously the trolley problems, where you have a runaway trolley running down the track and it'll hit some workers, and you have an opportunity to flip a switch to divert it onto a sidetrack where fewer workers will be killed, and then
Mhm.
you just sort of ask people what they would do. And there's this long tradition now within empirical psychology of categorizing people as being either utilitarian in their decision making or deontological in their decision making based on which way they flip the switch or whether they flip the switch. And I could get into a long critique of those line of studies. I don't think that you can actually categorize someone as a utilitarian for doing an action which is stipulated to maximize welfare, because you don't know if they're doing it out of a motive to impartially maximize welfare, or because they just realize that five is more than one, and I don't know, all else being equal, maybe that's what the experimenter wants me to do. I mean, you don't know that the person is actually acting on behalf of these utilitarian motives. But
Right.
nevertheless, a further problem, or maybe shortcoming, with this kind of work is that it focuses on anonymous one-shot interactions with strangers, which most of our moral decision making is embedded within networks of relationships where we stand within particular relationships with people. So, a parent-child relationship has different kinds of duties and obligations that are going to arise from that than I may have toward a stranger. A romantic partnership, certain kinds of behaviors are appropriate within that are not appropriate within a boss-employee relationship, let's say. Um, the neighbor relationship is constructed differently in different cultures. In New York City, the neighbor maybe is like a stranger effectively, because you don't rely on each other. You can just go down to the bodega and pick up what you need. But if you're in a rural village in Pakistan or something like that, the neighbor might be more like a family member. And so the duties that follow from the neighbor relationship in different cultures are going to be different. So it seems like if you want to understand people's moral judgments, about 99% of the stuff that we make moral judgments about, you have to understand how we're situated within relationships and what are the kind of special expectations or norms that are embedded within those relationships that thereby shape our downstream moral judgment. So it's largely about that kind of stuff.
No, that's wonderful. And because I always had this, I don't know, I'll call it snarky. We'll be nice. Call it snarky response to the trolley car. It's like, which one would you pick? Are you related to one of them?
Yeah, if it's your mom on the sidetrack, you probably aren't going to flip the switch, even though
That's
fewer people would be saved.
that's
So
right.
so what happens is, in the experiments, that's been filtered out, because the thought is, well, of course, if you had a relationship to the people, that would make it complicated. So let's make it simple. We'll just have it be some strangers that you don't know. But of course, if you don't even have to run the experiment to know that your judgment would change depending on the relational context, that's the signal that you should be studying. I mean, it's
Right.
obviously a massive effect that's going to change your moral intuition. So surely you'd want to account for that in some way.
Right. Well, and that sort of leads to the thing we were alluding to earlier, the problem of going about thinking about the mind different than the brain, the mind as a particle in physics that you can construct in a vacuum and test and have it do these various different things. But it's not really possible to do that if you have to strip out all the things that make it distinguishable from all the other minds.
And also, if I mean, there's this movement that's been going on for a while, but people are understanding within psychology that we're fundamentally social relational creatures. We're not individual, I don't know, utility maximizers or something like
Mhm,
that. We come into the world embedded in relationships,
mhm.
and our species in particular, among other types of species, fundamentally depend on social cooperation in order to function and survive and reproduce and blah blah blah. And so, in order to make sense of the mind that creatures like us have, you have to start with a social and relational lens, not start with the individual and go, oh yeah, and then like I guess like relational context would probably affect this. It's like, if you want to ask me how am I going to behave under X circumstances, and you don't tell me who am I in the room with and how do I relate to them and what's the nature of our cooperative enterprise, I can't answer your question. I can't even begin to answer your question.
Right.
And yet, so much of moral psychology has been focused on individual acts of decision making with respect to anonymous interactions with strangers.
Yeah, I think that's right, and that certainly is what you just laid out is in essence why I ended up getting drawn to Aristotle in my studies, because in some ways we are all having to come to ways to justify, I don't want to say Aristotelian conclusions, but in the Aristotelian framework without Aristotle's lack of information. Because we've gone through the scientific revolution, like we know that there's germs. we we have microscopes. We understand, that things aren't driven by forces or attractions, and these or the force of attraction, I should say. But we understand the laws of nature and the way that things that someone without a microscope just wouldn't. um, and yet there's something about human psychology that points us to these same kinds of ethical and political problems, because you can't really separate those things.
Mhm.
If because they're really all questions of character. How do you cultivate a certain kind of approach or way of thinking, which is embedded in a way of sort of being? And um,
And
yeah.
also being in relation with others. That's the other thing too. I think even people who study
Mhm.
virtues and character often individualize it, where one conception of character is that it's precisely that thing that you carry with you that's invariant across different
Right.
social contexts.
That's right.
But if your character is sort of co-constituted or co-created in relations with other people, you might expect that part of what it is to have a kind of a character is to have a character that activates differently in different social and relational contexts.
Right.
And then you have to kind of step up a level of abstraction to understand what is the thing about you that's constant across these different contexts and what should be constant
Yep.
versus what appropriately changes depending on the relational context.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I don't, one of the things I had to do was learn Greek, and which is, there's a reason there's the phrase, it's all Greek to me, because it's a very, if you haven't, have you had the experience to dabble with Greek?
No.
So yeah, there's a reason. It's a very different kind of language construct, and it has different, it has even different sort of tenses than we do, like conceptions of time and interaction. We have active and passive voice. They have a middle voice, that things can interact with one another, not be not merely receive nor be the actor, but be in, like, reading is a good example. Is the best one I've come up with. Reading isn't a passive activity, but it's not an active activity either. You're not changing the book by interacting with it, but you may be changed through the interaction. So the verb is very different. The word character and ethics, right? They're interrelated in Greek. An ethic, sort of is a display of one's character. And I think that's really exactly right. But those things are going to vary depending upon the thing that's called upon you. Courage looks differently in different situations. Even if it's all still courage, being on the battlefield is a very different thing than raising your hand when you're unsure. They both may require courage, but they're very, very different kinds of experiences.